"My gosh," said the oddly dressed man, as he looked out of the aeroplane window, "what foul weather. I would have been better off staying at home." This was the gentleman's first trip to England. In fact, it was the first time he had stepped outside the snowy continent of Antarctica. For hundreds of years, people had lived very happily in the village of Chilly Bottom, 3 kilometers east, or was it north, of the South Pole. Robert Falcon Scott, Bobby to his friends, was the first ever Antarctican to go abroad. When he arrived at passport control, he was met by a gruff voice from the border control officer. "Passport, please." Goodness gracious me, Bobby thought to himself. Where are this man's manners? "My good sir," he replied, "I have an important message to pass on to your king. I trust you will grant me safe passage." The officer looked over his glasses. "You what, mate? Where you from, the 18th century? I need to see a passport." Fortunately, the traveler had been told that he might run into a few problems at Heathrow, and he was well prepared. "Sir, let me explain. I come from the village of Chilly Bottom, in Bat, or British Antarctic Territory. I am, like your good self, I presume, a British citizen. Here are my papers. I have an important message for your king." The men slid a pile of old papers under the glass window, and waited patiently while the passport officer thumbed through them. "I'm going to need to show these to my boss. Wait here a minute, will ya?" Several minutes passed before a woman emerged from behind a glass door, indicating for Bobby to follow her. "Mr. Robert Falcon Scott, correct? This is all rather unusual, I have to say, but your papers do bear the royal seal." "The royal seal? From the South Pole? I had no idea one of my countrymen had come here already." Said the woman. "Moving on. I've run this up to my superiors, it's gone all the way up to Buckingham Palace, and I am told that the king will be happy to receive you. A car is waiting for you outside." "Smashing," replied Mr. Scott, raising his hat to the woman. "This is bonkers," muttered the border control officer, shaking his head. Mr. Scott could only assume bonkers was some modern slang used to describe situations of great importance. He smiled to himself as they moved him through security. It must be quite a rare occasion to see someone invited by the king himself. They arrived outside and guided him towards a sleek black limousine, and he wondered when he was going to meet the royal seal. As the car made its way through the streets of London, the men leant forward and started to engage the driver in conversation. "Sir, may I ask you a question?" The driver remained silent, but the men continued anyway. "Is it true that your king is holding penguins prisoners? That he has locked them up in cages for the amusement of the public?" Looking at him in the rear-view mirror, the driver's eyes met his, but they quickly turned back to the road and a stony expression covered his face. "Don't know about any prisoners, sir," said the driver in a peculiar accent. "And is it always such bad weather here?" "The sky is gray, and it's pouring with rain. It might be a tad cold where I'm from, but at least we have blue skies." "Well, yes, you didn't come to Majorca, sir." The pair continued in silence, until the car pulled up at the gates of Buckingham Palace. The door swung open, and a red carpet rolled down to greet them. At the top of a flight of stairs, a man stood dressed in black formal wear. Mr. Scott climbed up and bowed politely. "A pleasure to meet you, Your Majesty." Mr. Scott, I am Sir John Fitzwilliam Patrick. I am His Royal Majesty's butler, the man replied, his voice emotionless and cold. The butler. Why are you dressed as a penguin then? And if I'm not mistaken, a king penguin, with that tailcoat of yours. Surely such dress would be reserved for the king. The butler smiled. Mr. Scott, His Majesty is looking forward to receiving you. He will do so tomorrow morning, at 9 o'clock sharp. In the meantime, I have been told to make you comfortable, and to show you around. A footman will take your belongings up to your room. Please, follow me, we will sit a little and take tea. They settled into armchairs in a carpeted drawing room and servants worked around them, pouring tea and offering plates of some snow-colored food. Mr. Scott, could I be so bold as to ask you to tell me a little bit about life in Chilly Bottom, was it not? The Antarctican took a bite of the food, how odd, it tasted nothing like snow. And crossed his legs. Well, where do I start? Chilly Bottom is a small village in Antarctica, as I mentioned before. We are about 5 kilometers from the South Pole, and my parents, their parents, all of our ancestors, in fact, have lived there for as long as anyone can remember. We live a pretty normal and unremarkable life, really. I can't imagine it is so different from yours. We get up, we have breakfast, we sing songs, we worship the penguin gods, we drink tea with seal oil. It really isn't as remarkable as you. Hang on a minute, the butler interrupted. You worship the penguin gods. Precisely, the man replied. They bring us our food, delicious regurgitated fish, they stand around us when we're cold, and they allow us to ride on their backs when it is slightly warmer and we want to take a dip in the ocean. Without the penguins, life in Chilly Bottom simply wouldn't be possible. The butler looked straight at him, astonished. Sir, I want to know all about Chilly Bottom, but before that I simply must ask you something. Your voice, your manner of speaking. It is, how can I put it? It is like mine, it is like His Majesty's. You speak English like a true gentleman. But am I correct in that neither you nor anyone from Chilly Bottom has ever left Antarctica, nor had any contact with anyone outside your village? Well, my uncle did come across an African penguin once who had taken an unfortunate wrong turn. But yes, I am the first Chilly Bottomer to ever break the ice, as we put it. I mean, the first to leave Antarctica. If you are wondering why I sound so English, it all comes down to a book. Now, this goes back to the time of my great-grandfather, 1912 to be precise. Our methods of communication were different. Predominantly we conversed in the penguin tongue, a terribly harsh language, but beautifully poetic, and one day my great-grandfather found a book in the snow, next to a little device with a man's voice trapped inside it. We never found out who left it, but my ancestors studied the book, listened to the recordings, and started to adopt the language we heard there as our language. It is, if I am not mistaken, English that we are speaking now, correct? The butler nodded. Excellent. Well, anyway, we found it to be a delightful language, and much easier to pronounce than the penguin tongue. For one thing, we have the same vocal organs. So I was brought up speaking English by my parents. And as a little nod to the author of the book, I am called Robert Falcon Scott, as is my brother, my sister, and in fact everyone in Chilly Bottom. We have a real respect for tradition, you know. Doesn't that get a little confusing? Not at all. We know who we are referring to because we use slightly different tones. I'm Robert Falcon Scott, my sister is Robert Falcon Scott, and my brother is Robert Falcon Scott. Is that confusing for you? Well, I guess you get an ear for it. But let me ask one more question. Why exactly are you here, sir? The driver told me you were talking about penguins. Bingo, Mr. Scott replied. We heard, in fact, from that same South African penguin, who had heard it from a cousin of his who had spent some time on a nature reserve in Botswana, that your king has something called a zoo, where he keeps penguins locked up for the amusement of the public. As a British citizen, I have come to demand that he release them. Sir, Fitzwilliam Patrick interrupted, I'm not sure that you are a British citizen. How dare you, cried Mr. Scott. Chilly Bottom is a British Antarctic territory. Your king, our king, or some ancestor of his claimed it. I have grown up all my life knowing that I am a British citizen, and the suggestion that I am not quite offends me. Besides, that South African penguin told my uncle that people in Britain have quite a reputation for overseas territories. What is it you call them? Colonies, yes. Well, do you know who else has colonies? Penguins. But at least we have the decency to not to come to Britain and put your citizens in cages. The Antarctican brushed some crumbs off his lap and crossed his arms. For a moment, he said nothing, and the pair sat in silence. Fitzwilliam Patrick was the first to speak, taking on a peaceful tone. Sir, I do apologize for the offense caused. Let me reassure you that the king is looking forward to meeting with you tomorrow. In the meantime, let me show you something of the city. It is your first time in your home country, after all. Very well. Their first stop was the Royal Oak, a pub a couple of minutes away from the palace. You must be hungry after your journey, and those sandwiches weren't much. Fitzwilliam Patrick placed 2 pints of beer on the table. Shall we grab a bite to eat as well? Have you ever tasted fish and chips? It is something of a cliché, but they do it rather well here. His Majesty will pay for it. The Antarctican nodded, took a large sip of beer and immediately spat it out. What rubbish is this? He exclaimed. It has no fizz, it is completely flat. It's English beer, Fitzwilliam Patrick explained. I'm guessing you are more of a lagerman. Henry, could you pour my friend a pint of Kronenbourg? It is French, he whispered, and His Majesty has a bit of a thing about us not buying British, but I don't see a problem as long as we keep this between the two of us, don't you agree? Now, where was I? Ah yes, Henry, 2 fish and chips, 2, please. And make it snappy. Snappy, that was another new word, and from the way Fitzwilliam Patrick snapped his fingers, he could see it meant fast. Now that they'd settled down, Mr. Scott looked around with interest. All around, there was ugly carpet, sticky furniture, and drunk old men. This must have been what the book was referring to when it said, "Can't wait to get back to the pub and have a pint." For a moment, he was overtaken by emotion at the thought of this rich cultural tradition, and tears started to form in his eyes. Before he knew it, a waitress had brought out 2 plates. The men from Antarctica stared in complete astonishment. Fish and chips, Fitzwilliam Patrick repeated. You like fish, that's the big long thing covered in batter. I'm sure you like chips, I mean, who doesn't? And that green thing on the side there is. My dear man, Mr. Scott interrupted, I know very well what this is. And he took a big spoonful of the stuff. A moment later, it met the same fate as the beer, spat out all over the table. I don't believe it, he said. This has to be the worst rotten penguin poo I've ever tasted. Rotten penguin poo. Sir, I'm sorry to disappoint, but that's mushy peas. It is a small green vegetable that's been mushed up. It's something of a delicacy around here. Pa. I'd take rotten penguin droppings over this any day of the week. I'm sorry, sir, but I think I'd like to go back to my room now. I've come a long way, and I need to rest before meeting His Royal Highness tomorrow morning. Fitzwilliam Patrick nodded, and the pair returned to the palace. Mr. Scott slept poorly that night. He wasn't worried about the meeting the following day, rather, he couldn't get comfortable in his bed. They had given him some thin useless piece of cloth, rather than a nice warm seal skin, and he missed the sound of the sea in the distance. The following morning, the man from Antarctica was already showered, shaved and dressed by the time Fitzwilliam Patrick knocked on his door. Good morning, Mr. Scott. I shall now take you to His Majesty, King Charles III. Jolly good. They walked for what seemed like miles through identical-looking corridors, until they reached a door and Fitzwilliam Patrick said, "May I present to you His Royal Highness, the King?" The door opened to reveal an old man sitting at a table, dipping toast into a boiled egg and getting crumbs on his trousers. "Call me Charlie, please," the man said, extending his hand. "I really am thrilled to see you." Mr. Scott looked at the hand suspiciously. "Excuse me, sir, is this some kind of joke? I'm here to see the king." "You have no crown, you're dressed like a factory worker, and you'd rather I call you Charlie. I beg of you, please take me to see the king immediately." "Mr. Scott," the man said, his tone becoming friendlier still. "I am the king. How can I prove it to you?" I know." "Wilkins," he said, motioning to one of the men guarding the door. "Come over here for a minute, would you? Wilkins, please open your wallet and show the gentleman a banknote." The man carefully took his wallet out of his pocket, and pulled out a piece of paper, handing it to his master. "This is a 10-pound note. Take a good look at it." He passed it to his guest. "Notice anyone familiar?" he added with an artificial smile. Mr. Scott furrowed his brow, looking down at the note and then up at the man standing opposite him. "You do look very similar to the fellow on there, I have to admit. It's just all a bit unexpected. I thought you would be, how can I say, different. No matter. Your Majesty, I am from the village of Chili Bottom. I am one of your loyal subjects, and I am here with an important request to make of you." With this, his voice grew sterner. "Release the penguins." The king looked surprised, and then gave a small laugh. "Release the penguins? And which penguins might you be referring to?" "Your Majesty, do you or do you not have a park in the city called Regent's Park?" "Well, there is a park called Regent's Park, but it isn't exactly mine." "And in this park, are there or are there not penguins being held captive, forced to do tricks for the amusement of the common men?" The king looked puzzled, and turned again to one of the footmen. "Wilkins, didn't you take your son to the zoo for his birthday a few weeks ago? Do you know if there are any penguins there?" "Yes, sir, there are. They feed them twice a day, Wonderful show they put on. My son absolutely loved it," the footman responded, evidently pleased to be involved in something other than opening and closing doors. "Well, Mr. Scott, there's your answer. There are penguins, but I think it's a bit much to say that I am keeping them captive. The zoo really isn't anything to do with me. Why is it that you are so concerned about them, may I ask? Have you really come all this way to ask me this question? If you have, I am awfully sorry that there is nothing I can do." Mr. Scott then proceeded to tell the king the same story he had told Fitzwilliam Patrick the previous evening, how they worshipped the penguins as gods, how they had learned English from a book found in the snow, and how the news of the penguins at London Zoo had made it all the way to Chilly Bottom. The king was very interested. As he listened, he furrowed his brows and stroked his chin. "You know, my dear Mr. Scott," he said, smiling, "I think there might be something we can do. I'm going to have to speak with my legal advisors, naturally, but I just think I might know a way to resolve this problem. Leave it with me, but we must meet again tomorrow, 8 a.m. sharp." The following morning, the Antarctic traveler rose bright and early, and made his way to the king's breakfast room through a maze of corridors. When he opened the door, he saw the king wearing the same clothes, unshaven, with a mad look in his eyes. Papers covered the table, and several old leather-bound books were piled up on chairs nearby. The king spoke quickly. "My dear Mr. Scott, may I call you Bobby?" "Bobby, I think we have it. You may know that the king is the legal owner of all swans in the country, but did you know that he also can grant himself ownership over any bird in the British Empire if there is a valid ecological or theological reason for it? The law dates back to 1314, but my advisors have told me that it has never been changed. This means, my dear boy, that we have a solution. You and the residents of Chilly Bottom are my subjects. I might not have known about you, I mean, nobody knew about you, but Chilly Bottom is British Antarctic territory, and that makes you one of us. As king, it is my duty to ensure that your religious beliefs are protected, and if your gods I should probably say, are being held in a zoo, then this is certainly a valid theological reason to call up Statute 1408.A Section 49. I'll have my team write a press release immediately." Throughout this speech, Robert Falcon Scott had been nodding away, MMING, in agreement with the king's every word. When the king finally finished, all the men from Antarctica could manage was a quiet, "Thank you, Your Majesty." He could hardly believe his ears. And so it was that, 48 hours later, all 73 penguins from London Zoo waddled onto a specially adapted aeroplane and made the long journey back to Chilly Bottom. 73 penguins and 1 man, that is, for right behind them was Robert Falcon Scott, the man who had rescued his gods. Mr. Scott kept a diary throughout his trip. The final entry reads as follows. London, April 2024. Leaving now. The people speak with a horrible accent. The weather is worse than a sick seal's bottom and they've never even heard of rotten penguin poo. I enjoyed my time in London, but I'm glad to be waddling home.